Good morning. All right. Good morning. Welcome to the East Main Church of Christ. It's great to see you all here today, and I'm happy to be with you. If you're live streaming with us, I'd like to welcome you, and we're glad that you're doing so. If you're visiting with us, you are our honored guest, and we ask that you stick around after class and after worship and introduce yourself to us, and we'll get to know who you are. I got confused because Brother Pettis had a saying, and I didn't want to hijack that, so my mind got messed up there. But just, anyway, introduce yourself to us, and we'll get to know who you are. Before class, I have asked Brother George Moss if he would lead us in a word of prayer.
Our Father art in heaven, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the beauty around us, the beauty of the creation. We know that you are in control of all things and work in the lives of men. We ask that you bless us this morning as we look into your word and help us to think about the truth there that applies to us and how we can be more like Christ and reflect the beauty of Christ. Help us as we study to understand what we're studying relates to the world around us and the rapid changes that are occurring each day. We're blessed with the truth. We're blessed with a sacrifice, an eternal sacrifice. Help us to always be aware. Help us to be always striving to please you. And help us to be what we should be through Christ. We do ask forgiveness of our sins, and we're thankful for a time to come together and a time to reinforce and build up. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
All right, this morning we're going to start in chapter 24. And I apologize right off the bat for being slightly under the weather. The doctor assured me when I took that pneumonia shot that they didn't know anyone who's had that shot and it made them sick. So I am the first person to say that, yes, that shot made me sick. So I had a fever and body aches and all of that stuff for the last couple of days. But I feel a lot better today, by the way. But anyway, I am dealing with that. Okay, so we're in Acts 24 this morning. And let's just back up. So Paul has been in Roman custody, I think, for about 5 or 6 days. So we counted, I think last week we talked about it. So day one is when we had all the big rioting and all of this stuff, and the Romans came down and they took Paul into custody. So we talked about that day one. They held him overnight, so that brings us into day two, and took him before the Sanhedrin. And then they got into a big argument there, and the Romans took them back into the barracks, and then Christ visited him in the night. And then the next day, which is day 3, then Paul's nephew came to him and told him about the conspiracy to kill him. And if you remember, Paul said, you need to go tell the tribune about that. So they did, and the tribune said, at 9 o'clock tonight, you take Paul and leave with him, go to Caesarea. So it took a day to get up to Antipatris, I think was the name of that city, and then another day to get to Caesarea. So he's been in custody about 5 days to where we are right now, and if I've got that counting right. So he brought to Caesarea, and I'm in chapter 23, verse 26, okay? And we talked about the letter that the Roman tribune, Claudius Lysias, wrote to Felix, who's the governor. Okay, now last week we got real short on time, so I wasn't able to get into this too much. So I wanted to back up and talk about some of the people that we're going to read about. So Felix, he was the procurator of Judea at the time, and I'm reading from Holman's Bible Dictionary, okay? He was at the time Paul the apostle visited Jerusalem for the last time and was arrested there. So that's in chapter 23, verse 24 is when Paul was arrested. So Antonius Felix became procurator of Judea in AD 52. Okay, so kind of, I don't know if you want to take a card and write dates down or something, because I'll try to make sense of it in a minute. Oh, hey, real quick, I forgot, I was going to mention this when we start off. So I wanted to reiterate a couple of rules for the class that we've had all along, but it's been a while. Okay, all comments and questions are welcome. Okay, so I don't care if you have a comment or question, you're welcome. But number two, if you want to make a comment or question, raise your hand, and make sure you raise your hand high enough. The guys with the microphones are in the back, so if you do one of these, kind of raise your hands like that, they're not going to see it because they're behind you. So make sure you get your hand up, okay? And then third, to make a comment or question, let's get you a mic. So like what Brother Jim was just saying there, I'm sure no one from this section all the way up that way and these guys over here and all in the balcony, they probably can't hear what Jim just said. So let's get a mic, and definitely the people streaming cannot hear. So when I've sat at home and watched the class or worship service streaming, if somebody makes a comment without a microphone, you don't hear anything. It's just dead air until the person with the mic says something. So, Brother Jim, if you have a comment, we'll get you a mic. He's coming right up behind you there. So let's do that, and that way everybody can hear, especially the people that are streaming. Go ahead, Brother Jim. We got to get the mic on, though. So give it a try.
Another title for Felix is governor.
Governor, yes. So in the version, I have in front of me a New King James and an ESV. So he's called the governor. But in Holman's Bible Dictionary that I was reading, they call him the procurator. But anyway, the main point I wanted to make here is that he was in power from 52 A.D. to 60 A.D. Okay, so that's the time frame. Paul is being brought before him. So that means that Paul came before Felix between 52 AD and 60 AD. Now we'll see in a few verses, Paul says, you've been in office for quite a while, or for several years, I think is what it says exactly. So it's not 52 AD, he's been in there a while. So I'm thinking it's getting on a little bit later on. Now I'll talk about Ananias in just a second. But Ananias was the chief priest until 58 AD. Okay, and I'll mention that again in just a second. So we know between 52 and 58 AD is when Paul went before Felix, what we're talking about now. Okay, so that means from then Acts chapter 1, okay, all the way up to, so Christ was crucified about 29 AD to 33 AD. Okay, somewhere right in there, that 4-year period. So I'm going to use AD 30 as a round number. It's just easier to do the math that way. So about AD 30. So if Paul then was brought before Felix between 52 and 58 AD, see, we're talking 25 years maybe, something like that. So from Acts chapter 1 to where we are now in chapter 24, it's about 25 years. Okay, that's the period of time that's elapsed. Also, I believe John mentioned this last week, but I wanted to give you some numbers this week. Paul, it's commonly thought Paul was about the same age of Jesus. Okay, so if Jesus died at about 30 or 33 years old, and you add that 25 years to that, right, Paul's 55 to 60 years old. Okay, he's right in that range right there. Okay, so that's how much time has elapsed from Acts 1 to where we are now, and that's about how old Paul was. And I believe John mentioned that, Paul wasn't a young man, so that may be one reason they put him on the horse when they took him up to Caesarea, is because he might not have been able to walk that far at his age. It was 60 miles, I think, is how far they traveled. So anyway, wanted to mention that. So Felix was the governor or the procurator, and let's see, so from 52 to 60, and then it was Emperor Nero that recalled him. Now, when we get into chapter 25, we'll see Felix is no longer there. He's replaced by Festus. So that happened in 60 AD. So where we are in chapter 24, when we get to 25, we're in 60 AD. Okay, so you can see the small window of time where we are right here. So anyway, Nero replaced him, and then that's about all. Okay, so that's about all I want to cover with Felix. So at least it gives you an idea of how much time has elapsed and how old Paul is. Okay, so that was one thing I wanted to call out there. The last thing I wanted to mention was in verse 35, when Paul was brought before, verse 35 of chapter 23, okay? When Paul was brought before Felix, and Felix heard Paul, and he said, okay, I'm going to hear your case, but I'm going to wait till your accusers get here, okay? And then in verse 35, he told the guards, keep him in the praetorium. Okay, now, and I mentioned this last week right as the bell was ringing. So the praetorium is the headquarters for the Roman soldiers. Now, if you're in a big city like Rome, the emperor has his own palace, and that's where he lives. Okay, if you're in a larger city, so the ruler, like a governor or especially the emperor, they lived in their own palace over there, and the guards, they had their praetorium, or their headquarters is over there. In Caesarea, I guess it's a small enough city, the praetorium is where Felix the governor lived, and it's also where the Roman soldiers were stationed. Okay, and I'll show you a picture of that here in just a second. So just wanted you to know, when Felix said, put him in the praetorium, that's where he lived, and that's also where the guards were. And one thing I wondered about that, why would he put him in the praetorium? And that may be the place where they kept people, but also we'll find out in chapter 24 as we go on, Felix and Paul had some discussions. So it may be, and we'll find out some other things here too about Felix, but maybe he wanted him close by, so if he wanted to talk to Paul, he could just call for him and they could talk, which they did. Okay, so anyway, just a couple of things there. All right, so that brings us down to 24. So Paul is in Caesarea. He's still in custody. He's in the praetorium, where the guards are and where the governor lives. Okay, and now we're waiting on the accusers to come up to Caesarea so they can make their accusations against Paul. So, Brother Greg, let's read verses 1 through 9 of chapter 24, please.
Now after 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders and a certain orator named Tertullus. These gave evidence to the governor against Paul. And when he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, seeing that through you we enjoy great peace, and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear, by your courtesy, a few words from us. For we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. But the commander Lysias came by, and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, maintaining that these things were so.
Okay. Now, notice it says, after 5 days. So Paul has been in custody now. We don't know how long, maybe a day or two. And then it says, after 5 days, finally, Ananias, the high priest, arrived in Caesarea. Okay, now, let's talk about Ananias. The reason I mentioned the 5 days, because I already mentioned that he was in custody for 3. They made at least a 2-day journey to Caesarea for 2 days. That's 5 days. Now it's 5 more days. So Paul's been in custody about 10 days now. And we'll see in just a second, Paul will actually make the comment. But by my counting, it's been about 10 days, at least. Okay, at least 10 days he's been in custody. Okay, then the high priest Ananias arrives. So Ananias then, let me get down to the part that applies to where we are. Then, let's see. One thing I wanted to mention about Ananias is that it's something Brother Wayne mentioned last week. So this system, it was corrupt. Okay, so you had the high priest, but if you remember when we studied the Gospel of Luke, we said that the Romans, for whatever reason, they removed the high priest and they put somebody into that position that they wanted in there. Okay, and then the reason they did that is, we talked about this last week or two, the Romans would take over some area, in this case Judea, so they would take over that area, and they don't have enough men to occupy the whole world. So if you ever see maps of the Roman Empire where the people are or where they occupy, most of the known world. They don't have enough troops. So what they would do is come in with a legion, take over, and then they would basically kill anybody that was opposed to the Roman occupation. And then anybody who really didn't care or who was willing to work for the Romans, then they would take those people and they would put them in places of leadership or places of governance in certain key positions. And then the Romans, through the local person that they had installed, would control the people below them like that. So they set up that type of structure. And also mainly the Romans spoke Latin or Greek, and then if they went into some area, kind of like Judea, where maybe they were speaking mostly Hebrew, they would use the local person who spoke the local language, knew the local customs, knew the local people. The Romans, through that person, then would rule over them. And think of the tax collectors. Okay, we've talked about that before, where the tax collector, like Matthew, being a tax collector, collected taxes, for the Romans. But he was a local person that he could go and they could converse and he could get the taxes and then, pay that back up. So that kind of thing. That's how they ruled. And Ananias is one of those people. They put him in that position. Okay, so they could, basically they could control him. One of the things that I wanted to mention there is that he was the ruler over the Sanhedrin, and we talked about that last week. And so by having him in that position, then the Romans were able to exert some kind of influence or a little bit of control over that body. One thing I mentioned here, again, I think I'm reading from Holman's again, that it said that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, but he was also an aristocratic Jew and he was a Sadducee. So we talked about Pharisees and Sadducees last week or the week before, but the thing I wanted to mention here is that the Sadducees were typically Hellenists. Okay, so they observed Greek customs and dressed the Greek way. They might have eaten Greek food. They probably spoke Greek. But the most important thing is the Sadducees were more aligned with the Roman government, okay, than the Pharisees. Remember, the Pharisee means to exclude, to set yourself apart and away from everybody else, whereas the Sadducees teamed up with the Romans. And so Ananias then, by coming down here in these verses, and he's bringing a spokesman with him, we'll get to that in a second, he's trying to play to the Romans a little bit because he wants to keep his power. The Romans can just tell him, you're no longer the high priest, and just put somebody else in there. There wouldn't be much he could do about that. So anyway, I wanted to bring that out, that Ananias, being a Sadducee, was aligned with the Romans, and so therefore he'd be more concerned about keeping the Romans happy, is where I was getting at there. And that may be why he took a personal interest in Paul, that he actually came up to Caesarea and took a personal interest in the case. Okay, and just as an by the way, he was the high priest from 47 A.D. to 58 A.D. So I mentioned already that Felix was from 52 to 60, and then Ananias was out of office by 58. So we have to reel that in. So we're only talking, 52 to 58 is when this happened. And most likely a little bit later into that time period by what Paul says here in just a second. So just wanted to give you a little background. So there in verse 1 then, we read, then after 5 days, Ananias came up with some elders and a spokesman named Tertullus. Now Tertullus would be like the prosecutor. Okay, so they bring up Tertullus, and also one reason that Ananias would bring him, or that group would bring him with them, is that they may not have spoken Greek. So when they get in front of Felix, the high priest and the elders, there in verse 1, may not be able to converse with Felix. So they bring Tertullus with them. So this is an interesting part. If you're reading a King James Bible, which Brother Greg was reading, you'll notice in verse 7 that he says, but the commander Lysias came by with great violence and took him, that's Paul, out of our hands. So remember the tribune, when he was notified that, hey, there's a riot forming down here, and he came down with the troops, and they just grabbed Paul and took Paul. That's what he's talking about. And in verse 7 there, he used that word our. Based on that, some scholars believe that Tertullus then have been a Jew. Okay, he's talking about talking about Ananias and the elders. So they took Paul, the Romans took Paul out of our hands. We were dealing with it until your guy got involved, basically is what he's saying. Now, if you're reading one of the more modern translations, which I also have in front of me, the ESV, verse 7 is not there. Okay, we go from verse 6 to verse 8. And that simply just means that in the manuscripts that were used to translate the ESV, there was no verse 7. The reason I want to point that out is because other scholars will say, with that verse missing, that Tertullus might have been Roman, that Ananias and the Sanhedrin engaged a Roman because they knew they were going before Felix, the governor, and they wanted to make sure that they had somebody who could communicate with Felix and get their case across and perhaps use an actual Roman, to do that. So anyway, that's just something I wanted to mention there. Depending on which version you have, it might read just a little bit differently, but I just wanted to point that out to you. All right, then in verse 2 when Paul had been summoned, and this would be in verse 2, then Tertullus began to accuse him. Okay, and he said then, so what he's saying then, now notice what Tertullus is saying, or what he said to Felix. He's really buttering him up. Okay, let's just notice what he's saying there. Since through you, O great Felix, right, we enjoy much peace, and because of your foresight, right, you're so smart and can see out in the future, because of your foresight, most excellent Felix, okay, reforms are being made to this nation, okay, right? You're changing things here, and then look at verse 3. In every way and everywhere we accept this change with all gratitude. Okay, so you can see Tertullus is buttering Felix up like that. Okay, and then in verse 4, he's saying, I don't want to waste your time any further, so let's just get right on to it. He said, I beg in your kindness to hear us briefly. So I'm just going to be brief. Let's just get right to it. I don't want to waste any more of your time. You're so important. Okay, so that's what he's saying. Now, I will say, and I kind of say that jokingly or a little sarcastically, he probably had to do that, because if it was thought in any way that he was disrespectful to Felix, they probably would have killed him. Okay, so I just wanted you to know, I mean, he's doing that for a reason. All right, so anyway, in verse 5 then we see the accusation. So, for we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world. Okay, so when he says throughout the world, he's probably referring to, if we go back and we think when Paul went up to the temple, who was it that accused Paul? It said the Asian Jews, or the Jews from Asia. Okay, and we talked about that. Paul had just come back from his third missionary journey throughout all of Asia, and he was gone several years. We'll get to that in a minute. But he's back in Jerusalem for Pentecost. And we talked about all these people from all around the world coming into Jerusalem for Pentecost. And we noticed back then when we were covering that chapter that the Asian Jews, that'd be modern-day Turkey, the Asian Jews were there in Jerusalem. They saw Paul, and they made accusations. And one of the accusations that they made was that he defiled the temple by bringing a Gentile into the temple. If you remember that, we talked about that a few weeks ago. So anyway, that's what he's talking about here in verse 5, that Paul has stirred up these riots among all the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now, one thing I want to call out, and it's only in my mind that I'm thinking this, and it's just me, because I didn't read this anywhere and I could be wrong. But if you remember when Paul first arrived in Jerusalem and he met with James and the other the elders there that lived in Jerusalem, if you remember, there was it seemed to be a little bit of a difference between the two. You know, if you remember, he was saying, hey, Paul, you know, why don't you give the appearance that you're following the law? Because we're here, if you remember that, we're hearing these things from Jews that you're teaching the Jews to forsake the law of Moses and to not follow in the customs. So we're here, and you know we're doing this is during the Feast of Pentecost, and there's a lot of these Jews from all over the world here right now, you might want to appear a little more Jewish, right? Just to kind of hold things down a little bit and not stir up any trouble. Okay, you remember Paul, if you remember, just read back a few chapters, when James and the elders advised Paul to do that. And of course, Paul, his point of view is, hey, I've been from here all the way out to, across Asia and over to Europe and back and all of that, and God sent me to the Gentiles. I've been converting Gentiles, right? So you almost see these two differences, very Jewish, James and the elders, and then I don't want to use the word a very Gentile Paul, but you see a difference in the two based on his experience. So anyway, they're accusing him to be the ringleader. Okay, so that's the point I'm trying to make, is that the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So it's Paul that's stirring these people up. He's the ringleader. Now that word sect, it means it's a subset of the whole. And let me actually read you just real quick the definition. It says it's a group having established their own identity and their own teaching over against a larger group to which they belong. Okay, especially the different parties making up Judaism in the New Testament. So if you think about Judaism, and Paul and especially the Jews, obviously in the synagogues where he was teaching, they're Jews. So they're in this larger group called Jews. But then they're also, he's also being accused, Paul is being accused of being the leader of this sect. So a subset of Judaism. They have their own rules and their own beliefs and their own teachings and all that, but they're part of Judaism. So at this point in history, the Christians were still looked at as a subset of Judaism. Okay, now we know that when we talk about Roman history, where the Romans, up to a certain point, viewed the Jews and the Christians as part of the same religion. Okay, they just had different views of the same religion. That eventually that broke off. And the Christians were viewed as their own religion at some point. But anyway, I wanted to point that out here because in verse 5 then, Tertullus is accusing Paul of being the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, and that refers to Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, so that's what he's talking about there. So he's saying this guy has gone all over the world as the ringleader of this sect of the Nazarenes, and he's stirring up riots all over the place. Okay, so that's what he's being accused of. And then in verse 6, and he even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. Okay, that's true. Okay, if you remember that, it's not true that he profaned the temple. It's true that they seized him. Okay, so the Jews did seize him. Now, if you remember when they accused him of profaning the temple and bringing a Gentile to the temple, if you remember, it said that they supposed. Remember, we covered that quite a bit in detail a few weeks ago. They saw Paul walking around with the Gentile, and they supposed that Paul had brought that Gentile into the temple, and but they made that accusation. And then boom, that started this big riot. Everybody got really worked up because he profaned here or defiled back then the temple. Okay, and it says then we seized him. Now, if you have a verse 27, then he's saying, but then the commander Lysias, then he came by, okay, with the troops, if you remember us talking about that, and with great violence took him out of our hands. Basically, again, we had this thing under control, and then your guy came in, and he took Paul and took him out of our hands. That's how we ended up in front of you. Okay, that's basically what the prosecutor is saying there in those verses there. Okay, so then as he goes on, then he says, then by examining him yourself, then you'll be able to find out for yourself from him about everything which we accuse him of. So Tertullus is telling Felix then, is talk to him yourself. You'll see for yourself from Paul, from his own mouth, that what we're accusing him of is true. Okay, and then the other Jews that were there, they were the elders. So if you remember Ananias, and it says in verse 1, came down with some elders. Okay, that would be people from the Sanhedrin. So there in verse 9, it says, then the Jews also joined in the charge. Yeah, that's right. He's right. What Tertullus is saying there is right. And then they affirmed the things that he was accusing Paul of. Okay, so that's the situation there. Are there any comments or questions there. Okay, we'll get the mic, got you a mic coming. Let me look this way. Any other comments or questions here? We'll get a mic started in your direction. Anybody? Okay, go ahead, Jim.
In your earlier comments, you mentioned Festus. And I don't mean necessarily to get ahead of us, but you need to watch what takes place here.
Yes.
Felix doesn't have backbone. He's sort of like Pilate. He will not do anything with Paul. And so we'll find out later that he neglects to send Paul on to Rome.
Yeah.
And when Festus takes over, he's the one that actually sends Paul to Rome.
Yeah, we'll get to that in chapter 25. Brother Wayne?
Yes, we need to understand that everything this Tertullus said was a lie, every bit of it. He says, we found this man a pestilent, a pest. He's just a pest, that's all he is.
Right.
A mover of sedition among the Jews. That's not true.
That's right.
He's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. No such thing.
That's right.
It's all a lie. He's going about to profane the temple. That's not true.
That's right.
Accusation was made, but no one could prove it because it wasn't true. He said, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. That's not true. They were not going to do that. They were going to kill him.
That's right.
And this high priest, older man, that's a long journey for him to take. And he couldn't get an automobile to drive up there. And so that shows how much these people were determined to kill Paul, to destroy him. But really, it was an attack against New Testament Christianity.
Yes. That's
And that's the thing that we need to remember in this thing. And so when he says we would have taken and examined him ourselves, that's not true. They wanted to kill him.
Yeah.
And Lysias came because of the violence of the people there, and that's the sense in which he rescued him.
That's right. And I think part of what Tertullus is trying to do is he's trying to tell Felix, this is really our problem, right? We'll take care of this. We don't need you involved. This thing got out of hand, and your guy Lysias took him, and that's how we're here. We were handling it ourselves. And I think, like Brother Wayne was saying, if Felix could say, okay, just take him then, since it's a Jewish matter, just take him and deal with him ever how you want to, Paul would have been killed, right there. And I think that's what the prosecutor there, Tertullus, is trying to do, is to say, this is really a Jewish matter. It doesn't need to be, we don't need to waste your time with this. But Brother Wayne's exactly right. What he's saying there is a lie, and absolutely they would have killed Paul. And I think that's what Tertullus is trying to do, is to just say, take him and deal with him then, if it's just your problem, and then you deal with it. We got Brother Wynn, Mike's coming to you. Is somebody over here? Oh, go ahead, Brother WD.
Just one little point, when Saul was chosen, and it said he's a chosen vessel of mine. Again, when you look at each one of us today, each one of our backgrounds, each one of our abilities, each one of our skills, one of his happened to be the fact he was a Roman citizen. And in this particular situation, that kept him alive.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
again, that's maybe back into part of that total picture of he's a chosen vessel. He has the protection of a Roman citizen.
Yeah, and he
So-
spoke Greek, that we talked about that, and also very well versed in the old law, so he could talk in the
So
synagogue.
all the things he had
Yeah.
going for him, that was one of the things that helped him this time.
Yeah, that's right. And this isn't the only time the Roman citizenship helped him either. Brother Wynn?
One thing I find interesting is the two perspectives. You have being presented to Felix. You have the letter from Lysias, where he says, that the Jews were going to kill him, and I came in with my army and I rescued him. And then you have the view from what Tertullus is saying, that, he came in with great violence and he tore him from us, where we were just going to judge him according to our law, So
Right.
it's really interesting, the two different perspectives that, Felix has presented with. One, this is, Paul was saved, and other one, Paul was, taken away from rightful judgment.
Right. And I don't know from Felix's perspective, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I didn't mention that. From Felix's perspective, who would he believe? I don't know, would he believe Lysias because Lysias was a Roman tribune, or would he believe Tertullus? I don't know. Just, Felix is a Roman governor. He's got a letter from a Roman tribune, and then he has a contradicting story from probably a Jew. So I don't know if Felix, I don't know if the Roman system would be, we're going to give the benefit of the doubt all the way down the Roman side, or would he fairly listen to both sides and then try to make a judgment? I'm not quite sure. I tend to lean that Felix would probably side more with the Romans. That's probably what they did, because just by the way they treated Paul, when they found out he was a Roman citizen, all that abuse stopped. So anyway, that's just what I think. Any other comments or questions there, Brother Jerry?
Well, we're about to get to where Felix is wanting Lysias, whatever his name is, the commander that interfered and wrote the note. He's going to wait until he comes to make a decision. At least he's doing that. He
Right.
wants to hear all the parties involved in this, and so he's going to wait.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay, any other comments or questions there? Okay, Brother Greg, let's read verses 10 through 16.
Then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, "Inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because you may ascertain that there is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd, either in the synagogues or in the city, nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and man."
Okay, so Tertullus then was speaking to Felix, and he said, here are the accusations. Ask Paul out of his own mouth, you'll hear him, he'll back up what I'm saying, basically. So then in verse 10, it says, then when the governor, that's Felix, had nodded to him, Paul, okay, Paul spoke. So basically we see then we have a transition from what Tertullus was saying, now we're going to hear from Paul. Okay, so that switch over like that. Okay, so that's where we are. So now Paul replied. So he says, knowing that for many years you have been judge over this nation. Now, if you remember, I said that Felix was in this position from AD 52 to AD 60. Okay, so, but we know the high priest was no longer in office, he was in until AD 58. So what's happening here is prior to AD 58, but it's after AD 52. And this is why I said when Paul says that for many years you have been here, so it's more likely a few years past AD 52. So we're up around AD 55, whatever a few years means, but it's been a few more. So Felix has been in this position for a little while. Paul says many years, okay? So Paul is saying for many years then you've been a judge over this nation, and I cheerfully make my defense. And he says, you can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. That's why I wanted to count those days out earlier, that I can count at least 10, okay? And I'm just assuming the trip to Caesarea took 2 days. It might have taken 3. We know how far it is. I had a slide last week that showed that. So Paul is saying here, I've only been here 12 days. Right? And I've been in custody, or at least 10 of those 12 days that I've been here. Okay, so that's why I wanted to point that out. It's not been more than 12 days since I went up to the temple, okay, and to worship. okay? And then he says in verse 12, he's basically, it's what Brother Wayne was saying earlier, they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd. That's true. He's saying, or either in the temple or in the synagogue. Right? Paul is saying, I didn't do anything that I'm being accused of. And now the part that I find interesting, in verse 13 then, neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. And then he goes on, but I confess to you that according to the way, okay, now look at the way Paul says this, according to the way which they call a sect. Paul's making a differentiation there. Paul is saying Christianity is not a sect. It's not a subset of Judaism. Okay, that's what he's saying there, according to the way which they call a sect. Okay, so he's separating those two out. Okay, we see that there. And he's saying then, he goes on then, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets. Now, if you remember a few weeks ago when we talked about the accusations that the Jews made against Paul, that he was teaching the Jews to forsake the teaching of Moses and to forsake the customs, and then I read some scripture from 3 of Paul's letters, Colossians, Corinthians, and I forget the other one, and I think it was Galatians. I read scripture from 3 of his letters where Paul said that the old law is a schoolmaster. It points or brings us to Christ. And then we talked about Christ has come. So the old law has brought us to him. He has come. Therefore, we're no longer under the old law. Okay, so when Paul, here in these verses, when he says, I believe everything that's in the law and the prophets, that's what he's referring to. The law and the prophets bring us to Christ. Okay, and then he says, he goes on, so I believe what's laid down in the law and the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept. Paul talking about the way Christians and the Jews all have this hope in God. He said, these Jews, they accept this hope in God. What is that hope? Well, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. Okay? So he's saying there's that hope of the resurrection. Okay, and that's what he's saying. Now, let me get to this last one in verse 16. So, okay, so you see that word so. So he says, I believe as they do, they must be Pharisees. Now, remember, Ananias is probably a Sadducee. But anyway, he's saying that we all have this hope that there will be a resurrection of the just and the unjust. And in verse 16, then so, or because of that, or as a result of that, I always take pains to have a clear conscience towards God and man. Now, this reminds me back when they asked Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? What did he say? Love the Lord thy God with all their heart and with all their mind. And then when he said, and the second is like it, love thy neighbor as thyself. You see this right here. Because of this hope of the resurrection, both the just and the unjust will be resurrected. Therefore, I take great pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. Okay, so he tries to do what's right in the sight of God, and he tries to do what's right as the way he deals with his fellow man. Okay, so we see that. And the reason for that is because of this, the hope of the resurrection. There's a lesson for that right there for us today. If you know the just and the unjust, we're all going to be resurrected. Okay, therefore, take great pains to live right in the sight of God, and take great pains in the way that we treat our fellow man, especially if you read, 1 John about the way we treat brothers and sisters in Christ. But this is what Paul is saying there, is that we're going to stand before God, and therefore I want to take great pains to make sure that I'm living right before God and that I'm treating my fellow man in a godly way. Okay? Now, do we have any comments or questions? We've got about 1 minute. So if we have any comments or questions, if not, we'll stop right here. and we'll go on. Now, don't think that Paul is just telling this to Felix. There's a little bit more that we'll read a little bit later next week. But I hope you've enjoyed this and a little explanation of some of the background of the situation, and we'll pick up here next week. All right, thank you very much.